you were present at yesterday morning's devotional by Ted Hamilton, he mentioned a book that he had just written and said that he was going to bring copies over. And he lugged in a whole big box of his new book called The Healer, Peace, Prayers, and Promises. These are free for everyone here. You can come up during the break. Okay, Renee is going to help pass these out. So please feel free to carry that home with you. It's a really nice gift that he provided. So thank you. Okay, so I just noticed by the schedule that I'm actually the session host for this session, which is great because I get to introduce colleagues from Andrews predominantly, although there are a few in other places as well. And I called a bit of a privilege on this one to give each presenter group 20 minutes instead of 15 minutes. We had a little extra time in the schedule, and so I decided to give this group a little bit of extra time because they are analyzing really important church data, and it's a really big data set with some really interesting findings. And so I would like to introduce first, on the theme of the World Church, Karl Bailey as our lead presenter, also assisted by Zoe Shiu, Shannon Trecartin, and Duane McBride, all from Andrews University. And the title is Not a Needy Person Among Them, a network analysis of prosocial and religious behaviors. Karl Bailey.
Thanks, Kurt. So this is some work that's in progress. Zoe and I have been constructing these networks, and then Shannon and Duane are helping us digest them. And part of the reason that we're looking at these networks is a question that came from ASTR and from the Future Plans Working Group, asking what is it that connects our religious life. So some quick acknowledgements. This research is funded by Archive Statistics and Research at the General Conference, also by a Research and Creative Scholarship grant from Andrews University. The data is not collected by Duane or I. In fact, there are these magnificent teams all around the world that do some really amazing things. If you talk to one of the principal investigators from a division team sometimes they can tell you these really fantastic stories about how they get this data so that we can combine it into a meta-analytic data set and talk about it. So we are representing the meta-analysis team that puts this data together. You can see their names there. And some of this work comes out of work we did last summer as part of the research group, and Crystal Collins helped us with that. Okay, so here's a quick overview. A quick overview of the data set, how it was constructed, and this will apply to not only my talk here, but then to the next two. So keep this in mind for the next hour or so. So this is data that was collected in 2017, 2018. We now say this is pre-pandemic data. There is currently data collection going on that we'll call pandemic data, I guess. This is about 63,000 cases. Obviously, not all those cases are complete. So for most of the variables we look at, we have about 50,000 to 60,000 complete cases. The data is not evenly distributed across the planet, but neither are Adventists. So when people ask, do you weight the data? We could do that, but we don't, because in general, the data in the sample is weighted about the same as where we see larger numbers of Adventists and where the church is growing most rapidly. And so weighting would distort some things, not weighting distorts other things, and so this is not weighted by population or by sample size. So you can see where the distribution is from. When you think about this data should be thought of as data that is collected from core Adventists. So these are people who were probably at church. That's how they knew the data was being collected. Some of them, depending on where in the world you are, some of them responded to a call to do this electronically. Some people did this in church. Some people did it after church. Some people came back. They walked back to church on Sunday and filled out the survey. So these are all people who invested substantial time. This is a large survey. It takes substantial time to fill out. And so these are core Adventists, people who are committed to the church. It would be great if we had people who had left the church as part of the sample, but we don't. So that means that we're not exploring all of the possible space. And that actually drives part of why we did this analysis the way that we did it. I talked about the valid responses and how this data is collected by people who are familiar with those particular regions. The project was approved by the Andrews University IRB and then often approved in different parts of the world as well. Okay, so here's the idea that we're looking at with this particular approach to this data. When we ask why people are the way they are, you can get a couple of different answers. One answer that people sometimes give is, well, people are the way they are because they can't be anything else. They're born that way. They have a particular genetic makeup. They live in a particular place. That's just how they are. But another way that we can answer that question is saying, well, people are the way they are. The reason that people are consistent is because there are a lot of forces that push them to not change. We can call this dynamic stability. There are a lot of forces, I'll show you a picture in just a moment, that get people to be kind of like each other and to be stable across time. And we actually can see this in features of human experience like personality. So there's a map here on the screen. It is a map of extroversion. And what it shows is that people in the upper Midwest and people in the Southeast, including here in Florida, are the most extroverted people. And there are more extroverted people in those places than there are in other places like the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, where I spent some time. So I was comfortable because I'm not extroverted. So there are clusters of people that are like each other. And they seem to be like each other not because they have a particular personality type, but because we have these small differences in personality that then shape the choices people make and lead to small differences in people's actions. And those shape what other actions people take, but those also start to shape the norms that people have for what is okay to do and what kinds of personality traits you should admit to having. And then they change the kinds of institutions and structures that are present in the world. And that leads to different kinds of institutional investments. And those lower the costs of some actions and raise the costs of others. And the consequence of that is that you get people looking like each other and doing similar things in similar places. Okay, so let's assume that that happens within the Adventist church, that there are things in the Adventist church that, depending on where you are, push you to be a certain kind of Adventist. That could happen. So we have lots and lots of measures in this data set, hundreds of questions, and we can build lovely little, let me just point at something here. We can build lovely little correlation matrices like this. Now, I've made that correlation matrix so that it's colored so you don't have to try and read a whole bunch of numbers. Like, we can take numbers and we can change the color so that if they're positive numbers, they're blue, and if they're negative, they're red. And we can change the saturation so that the bluer the color, the stronger the correlation. And you can look at the correlation, matrix and you can say, wow, that's a big correlation matrix. But what does it tell us? We can pick out strong correlations, right? And Duane shows you some of those strong correlations that we know are in the data set that match up actions that we take in the world that improve the world around us, so prosocial actions, and link those to elements of religiosity. But what's really driving things, right? That's the question we want to answer. Well, it turns out that making a matrix isn't the only way to display these different correlations. We can also turn them into a network, which is what I've done down here. And in that network, the thicker and more saturated or bluer the lines, the stronger the connections. And then we can say, well, hold on, if I've got a matrix that big, I'm doing a lot of statistical tests. So maybe some of those connections are spurious. So let's remove some of the ones that might be spurious. And we can build these lovely networks where we can identify communities or groups of behaviors or experiences or attitudes that go together strongly. And we can start to ask, what links one community to another? What is it that that's driving this particular psychological experience? What's driving this particular behavior? In our case, what is it that's linking religious behaviors and practices and beliefs to prosocial actions? So the impetus for doing this comes from some other areas of psychology. So we are now using network models much more commonly to look at how memory is structured. So this is how I got into this. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, and we're trying to think about how people are structuring their thoughts and their memories and their ideas. But personality psychologists are using network models to try to understand what elements of personality are keeping people in this dynamically stable kind of personality state. And this has been really used in psychopathology. That's where most of the work has been done, to ask questions about comorbidity. So why is it that people who are depressed often also experience some of the symptoms of anxiety? What's bridging things? It turns out sleep is one of those bridging symptoms. So what you can see here are these bridging symptoms between anxiety and depression, and one of those is sleep. In fact, this last semester, Sierra Philpotts and I reanalyzed some open data on burnout in the workplace and at home. And we found that the two symptoms that bridge workplace burnout and parental burnout are exhaustion. So when people are exhausted at work, it leaks into the home because of that exhaustion, right? So we can ask really interesting questions about how things get worse for people or how things get better for people. That's what we're going to look at here. All right, so our idea about why this might be something that happens comes from the book of Acts. So Acts chapter 4, we read this passage. All the believers were in one heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. And with great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. So the claim here is religiosity can be connected in very powerful ways to pro-social action. Fantastic. So can we see that in the global church member data set? Now, just so you know, there is some evidence from other studies that religious practices can be related to broader pro-social behaviors. So what we're going to ask here in this last 10 minutes is, how is it that religious practices are driving pro-social behaviors? Is it the Bible reading? Is it something about church attendance? Is it Sabbath school? Is it family worship? What is the bridging connection between religiosity and pro-social behavior? All right, so let me quickly walk you through the different kinds of items we put into this network, and then we'll look at the network. So we have 7 pro-social behavior items. Some of them have to do with things that are more clearly religiously connected, like helping others with religious questions and struggles. Others have to do with things like reducing poverty in society. So these are from the horizontal faith maturity scale. We have some social religious practices that describe how people meet together in all sorts of different ways. We have some social religious practices that refer to some of the things that David just talked about at the very end. So forming friendships, meeting the needs of non-Adventists, things in the church, supporting other church member to grow, witnessing to non-Adventists in my community. I'm reading all of those for a reason. We have things about how often people receive visits from people in their church. We have 8 items about personal, private, devotional practices people might engage in. We have some items that look at whether people feel like they have a purpose, a meaningful purpose, let's say, at church, and whether they're part of a community, whether they're able to form relationships with other people at church. And then we have a few items about how people might feel that they're being thwarted in their ability to connect to their church. And this is the nerdy statistical part of this. So this is how we built our network. We used a particular algorithm that builds a network, and I can actually show you little pictures here. So it builds a network that is a sparse network. So what we're going to do is we're going to limit the number of connections that we build to try to avoid building too many spurious connections into our model. And we built this network based on the strongest connections available in the data set. So we start with the four most highly correlated items. That's the core of our network. And then we build out adding each node to 3 other items, obviously with their strongest connections, and so forth and so on. And you can see that some things end up being connected to by many other nodes and others end up on the periphery. And this allows us to identify the core of that network and then the periphery. All right, so here is our network. This is what all the items form, and you can't read any of that, and that's okay because I'm going to describe it for you. So here's our prosocial behavior items over here on the side. You'll see that they all cluster together. You would expect that because they form a coherent scale. The question is, what's connecting them to everything else in here? Down here, we have needs support. So what this is saying is there's a connection between having your psychological needs being supported at church, feeling that you have a meaningful role in church, and engaging in prosocial behavior both in the church and outside the church. And notably, right here, that's the one that says, I can meaningfully serve in my church. Okay. Over here, we have witnessing items that form a coherent community. And notice that that is where we're bridging things here. So witnessing is going along with prosocial behavior. It's not church attendance. It's not reading your Bible. Not that you shouldn't read your Bible and not that you shouldn't attend church. But if you want to drive prosocial behavior by having people show up in the pews, what this network says is that's not going to happen. In fact, it turns out that going to meetings is also driven by witnessing, and probably vice versa, right? And so the core of this network sort of rotates around people having something meaningful to do in their church, right? Not the receiving of knowledge, not the being present, but the being able to do something meaningful. So can we capture that with some statistics? We can. Oh, and then up here's our needs, the wording. It's maybe interesting and a little troubling that feeling that you're being thwarted at church is positively correlated with receiving visits from people at church. And maybe we can think about why that might be. Because the question doesn't ask why you have to visit. All right, so the big idea here is that prosocial behavior is more strongly related to this meaningful engagement, what I've called here ongoing construction of the church community, more than mere attendance or devotional practices. In fact, we could argue that attendance and devotional practices may actually be flowing in the other direction. People who are meaningfully engaged in their church might be at church more often and might be engaging in devotional practices, right? And so if we try to drive things from the periphery, we may find that we don't get all the way to prosocial behavior. If you're from any part of this world, this should matter to you because it turns out that if we build the networks for each of the divisions individually, you get basically the same network. If there are differences of how tightly communities are together. So sometimes, like what you see here, they'll form a single community, but the position of nodes within the network is relatively stable. All right, so what we do then is we ask what's in the center, and what we see in the center are items like this, right? So being involved in ministries during the week, so not just church on Sabbath, being able to help people with religious questions. You also see reading Ellen White as a central item. It's not a central item in the network, it's a central item among devotional practices. So we reported this about 3 years ago. Reading Ellen White and SDA literature seems to be the thing that links together different pieces of people's devotional life. So that's why that's showing up there. So here we're looking at, right, so here's reading Ellen White, but here are these being involved sorts of items, right here in the center of that network. And then if we ask what's bridging between different communities, right, here are your 5 things to invest in. Training people to be able to help each other with religious questions, which makes you feel useful. Involving people in ministries during the week and on Sabbath, helping people to be prepared to witness to non-Adventists, and helping people to support each other. Right? All things that are about building community. And again, these are these nodes right here in the center. And then I've just marked with an arrow this one here, where people feel like they can serve in a meaningful way. And when I say that people can serve in a meaningful way, I want to point us back to Acts 4, right? So it's not just sufficient to make sure that people are engaging in prosocial behavior, but rather there needs to be this feeling that people are feeling like their participation in the church is meaningful and that it's powerful, right? So there's this description in Acts of what we think we're seeing in this network, where people feel like they're not just at church, but they're making a difference in the church. And that's the thing that seems to be so profound. All right, so what can we take from this? We're, I think, at a place where this cross-sectional data pushes us in the direction of trying some interventions. So, and these are interventions that the World Church desperately wants us to take, right? So you've heard about total member involvement. This is a network that says that total member involvement is at the heart of everything we want for Seventh-day Adventist church members. We want Seventh-day Adventist church members to have a good private devotional life. We want Seventh-day Adventist church members to be at church and Sabbath school. We want Seventh-day Adventist church members to make a difference in their community. Well, at the heart of that is having a meaningful place to serve in the church. There is perhaps nothing more important, right? That's what the network is pushing us to say. Nothing more important than being part of a small group within your church that is doing something meaningful. Not just talking about meaningful things, but doing something meaningful. And so what we need to do next is to partner with churches to try to increase member involvement and see if these other elements of the network also increase as well. All right. Thank you. And we'll move on now to a talk from Duane that looks at a different piece of this data set. Oh, no, it's not Duane. It's Thanks.
Switching.
So I'm actually doing this on behalf of my father, Dr. Duane McBride, who obviously isn't able to be here. He is still online, so he'll definitely be able to answer your questions, but we thought it would be better if I presented it in person.
Big button forward, little button goes back. That's for spotlight.
Right, okay.
The title of the talk is Correlates of Legalism in a Global Sample. Alina.
So if I were to ask you all, and I'm not going to ask you, how many of you actually know for sure you're saved? How many of you? Well, this is actually a complex issue, isn't it? So this is actually something Christians have been trying to figure out. And the Protestant Reformation was actually a response to the salvation by works of the Catholic Church. But later generation reformers thought there really needs to be more of a holiness movement that's focused on our moral behavior. The term sanctification then was used as an emphasis that a Christian should or could become free from sin. There's also that element, right? The Wesleyan for Reformation, really it's part of the Methodist Church now, is focused more on what is called the second blessing, in other words, sanctification. So our goal is to be Christ-like, right? It's a lifetime goal to be sanctified, to be Christ-like. And of course, what was Christ? He was able to not sin, right? So there's that possibility that we could be like Christ and then no longer sin. So this is part of what Adventists have inherited as part of our view. So we have righteousness by faith, but we also have, but we can become free from sin. How do we do that? So actually, it's number 10 of our 28 fundamental beliefs to actually say, yes, salvation is through Christ alone, right? Okay. But we also, Adventists do not see salvation as a works-based doctrine, right? So we definitely, that's part of who we are, but rather righteousness, right? This is from Christ alone. But we also have the holiness tradition, where we're looking at the moral and behavioral aspects of living like Christ. Again, to be like Christ, to be without sin. So social scientists have viewed actually Adventists as a strict church. So in other words, there's specific behavioral elements that are expected to be a member of our church. For instance, obviously going without substances, emphasis on the vegetarian diet. So the purpose of this study, we looked at questions from the Global Member Health Survey, the Global Member Survey of Seventh-day Adventists, and we looked at these 4 questions. These are ones that we labeled as legalism. This is what we're actually kind of trying to measure. So I am saved the moment I believe and accept what Jesus has done for me. I will not get to heaven unless I obey God's law perfectly. Following the health message ensures my salvation. To be saved, I need to be baptized into the SDA church. And you can imagine some of these statements we will be concerned about as a church based on what our beliefs are, right? So we're trying to figure out, okay, what possibly increases or decreases possibilities of legalism. So we looked at generation, in other words, age, right? Which age are you? Gender, is there a difference between males and females? Parenting style, I think a lot of us maybe are raised in the church. We think, well, maybe if those parents were too strict, then maybe the kids will be too more legalistic. So that was something I threw in there. And then there's a cultural context. As was mentioned before, maybe culture has something to do with some of the influence of our human behavior. So methods is actually already described by Dr. Bailey, so I'm not going to go into the detail on that. So here it is, the actual answers to these questions. So on the, let's see, I'm looking at what you're looking at. So on the far right, that's strongly agree. So in other words, I am saved if I accept Jesus. So that's a good percentage. So that's 66%, good percentage. Then agreeing, so a vast majority. So again, believe that. So that's great. But it gets a little more complicated with the other one. So on the right, strongly agree, must obey the law perfectly or be saved. So that's a big percentage. Now, it's not as much of a difference with health message ensure salvation. But again, there's a lot of people who agree in ways that we don't want them to agree as a church. This is not what we're trying to say, or that you must be baptized in order to be saved. So it's not about righteousness by faith, is it, when people are answering these questions? So this is the complicated aspect of these 2 beliefs. Where we break it down a little bit more. So yes, again, we believe righteousness by faith, 90%, right? This is great. And actually, most divisions is actually over 95%. So there's a huge percent. We got that part. But generally, majority of respondents also agree with legalism statements. So obviously not as huge, big of a difference, but still a good chunk. So now we're trying to figure out why is that? Why is it there is such a fairly high percentage of legalism that people are believing in within our church? So actually, okay, let's decide if there's actually differences by gender. No differences around the world. In fact, a lot of the correlates, we didn't find a whole lot of gender differences. There are differences by generation, where 70% of those who are 18 to 25 compared to those who are over 65 were more likely to be legalistic. And this is something developmentally is actually quite common. That's actually an area that I study. And they're just more likely to be black and white in their thinking. And with age, I think we learn things over the years and things are a little bit more gray. We're a little bit more open to other ideas. Now, what about those who are raised in the church? Maybe there's something there. So youth raised in the church or who joined as children who were raised by authoritarian or permissive parents. Now, let me try to help you understand how we define authoritarian versus permissive. So this is the variable that I threw in there. So authoritarian is actually decided on who decided who you hung out with, what media you watched, and when you went to bed. Was it your parents, both you and your parents, or you alone? So it's really parental control is what we were measuring. So those who had parents who were more controlling were more likely to be legalistic, but also permissive parents. And really that was what we were feeling it was looking at was whether or not parents were really involved in your life. So again, if you don't have parents trying to help you understand maybe some of the black and white the more gray elements of some of these religious aspects, and you're just kind of left up to your own devices as a kid, again, more likely to be black and white, more likely to have that more legalistic idea. But again, the correlations were low. So these are low correlations of both of those. So those really explain it. So gender, age, whether or not you're raised in the church, parenting style, really not a whole lot there. But culture, well, okay, let's understand culture a little bit though. Now culture, the way the church is organized is by divisions, right? And so we collect the data by divisions, but divisions aren't all homogenous, are they? NAD maybe to a certain extent, but even that's not homogenous, really. But when we look at the overall world divisions that were the lowest in legalism, they were in the Northern Hemisphere. So the division-wide, we can kind of look at some of those things. For example, only about 8% of the respondents in the NAD strongly agreed that one had to keep the law perfectly to be saved, compared to 64% in this ECD. So there was some division differences. But most of the divisions around the world are very different. So, for instance, SPD includes Australia and New Guinea. So there's a lot of cultural variations there. So this is something I really got to give credit to Dr. Bailey, right? I think he did a lot of work on this. And Dr. McBride also was a part of it as well. There's actually a lot of different ways to try to measure culture. Obviously not by division, right? There's actually a lot of different ways. And so I'm not going to be able to explain all of them. There's actually a lot of interdependent, a lot of similarities between these. But when you think about correlations, guys, remember correlations, a perfect one is 1.8. In my work on the role of parents on the prevention of youth health risk behaviors, I get thrilled when I get a 0.2. This is 0.8, okay? Whereas a social progress index increases, legalism decreases. So there's a lot of that. The only one that's a positive as disease prevalence increases, then so does legalism. So, but we're only going to be unpacking one of them. So the highest correlation between legalism scale and culture was the social progress index. So again, a correlation of 0.854. So this is really a broad inclusive index. There's a lot of things that it looks at. So let's just look at kind of the main three elements here. Is basic human needs, nutrition, and basic medical care, water and sanitation, shelter, personal safety, foundations of well-being, access to basic education, both genders, access to information, health and wellness, environmental quality, and third, opportunity, personal rights, personal freedom, and choice, inclusiveness, access to advanced education. So these sound like good things. I mean, these are things that societally, think about the issues that Dr. Williams just was talking about. If we had these things, there would be a lot of benefits to culture. So when you think about correlations, there it is. So this is actually by country. Okay, so boy, but you have an idea, right? I see it a little bit better on my screen, that the color, how things are going. So again, as social progress increases there, then our legalism goes down. So the countries, those of you who may not be able to see in the back, on the bottom right-hand corner is Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, Germany. United States is in there too. In the upper left-hand corner, we have South Sudan, Papua New Guinea, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Tanzania. So those are countries that are more likely to be legalistic, but also are lower in social progress index. So let's actually try to understand then, where does legalism flourish? Well, it's in the countries where basic human needs are not met. So this is, shelter, water, sanitation, so on, where there's limited access to education and information, and then pollution is higher. So again, think about these things on the global aspect. And then also where there's less economic opportunities, limited personal freedom. So you know what? It's not your parents' fault. It's not the church's fault. This is actually a cultural element that we need to better understand. So why does it flourish? Okay, where? Okay, but why? So sociologists argue that fundamentalism flourishes in insecure, chaotic environment and or where there's rapid social change. In fact, some of the things that we're seeing in the United States is reaction or perceived reaction to too much rapid social change. And so it leads to this increase in fundamentalism. So anthropologists, psychologists have also focused on what is called cost signaling. So it's maybe another why. So behaviors that are difficult have costs that signal to others group membership. So think about being a member of a strict church, right? Where again, how many of you actually work in the public sphere where your colleagues are like, why is it you can't do this on Sabbath? Or why is it you're always eating vegetarian? Why is it you never drink alcohol? There's a cost to being a part of that. And so when there is a cost, it discourages those that are only committed to those elements. But there also is an element of it where we may not really be able to fully commit because of that cost. So again, the things that we do is Sabbath keeping, no substance use, dietary issues. These are things that there is a cost publicly to being a part of this group, being a part of the church. So as researchers have noted, because the context of the signals, individuals often behave differently. So it's hard doing these things. So are we really able to be perfect? And remember, culture has something to do with it as well. When we think about those who live in some of these African countries, do they easily have access to vegan products, food products? Think about, in fact, if they were completely vegan, it would lead to early death. I mean, think about pernicious anemia. If you don't have vitamin B12 added to some of these things, it would lead to death. So there's some elements that actually it's not even possible. But there's also, again, that cost signaling issue where Adventist public events are almost always vegetarian, right? How many of you go to your the church potluck? It's vegetarian food. And how many of those people are eating that lovely potluck food are actually serving vegetarian food at home? Well, we actually know 45% think they can actually pick and choose. They don't actually have to do everything we're supposed to. And then even in one of the highest scoring legalistic divisions, ECD, about 45% of them also think that they can pick and choose the elements of the health messages they need to obey. Actually, the NAD, which is the lowest on legalism, actually has the highest rate of vegetarianism. Well, because it's easier, right? It's easier in the U.S. to be able to do that. So really, religious beliefs are strongly influenced by cultural context. We really need to better understand that. Our data suggests that righteousness by faith and rejection of legalism is much more likely to occur in an environment that meets basic needs. So think about Jesus. What did he do, right? He actually fed the 5,000, didn't he? He met their basic needs. He raised people from the dead and sometimes the widow whose son died. By raising that son from the dead, he was able to provide the basic needs for that widow, for that family. So really think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If people do not have their basic needs met, and I'll show you a visual of it to remind you of what that's about. People don't have their basic needs met, it's really hard to think beyond just that survival, again, that black and white thinking. So churches really need to be part of the cultural development in order for righteousness by faith to be understood. So again, we have to move beyond that to be able to get to these higher thinking processes. So think about AHSRA. I mean, what are they doing, right? They're actually out there trying to meet the basic needs of individuals. I mean, think about what's going on in Ukraine. There are actually things that have to be done in order to be able to move beyond that black and white and survival thinking. So to help you understand Maslow, to remind you of what that was about. So on the bottom, this is where, again, we are needing our physical needs met. Then by the time we actually finally then get, in order to be able to feel safe, we have to have those physiological needs met. In order to feel love and belonging, we have to have safety. In order to feel that esteem, we have to have that love and belonging. And then in order to have that morality, the creativity, the part that we're talking about, the whole idea of understanding righteousness by faith, that's on the top. You have to have all those other things met before we can even understand the complex idea of righteousness by faith. That there's not a black and white, okay, this is what you do in order to get that. I know it'd be nice, right? It'd be nice to be like, okay, in order to go to heaven, you just do that. But it's not that easy. But then if people are just stuck in that just physiological, I need to survive, that's what they're more likely to hold on to. That's more, it's more clearly clear to them as to what they have to do. It also gives them the idea that there is something within their power, there's something that can be done. And then again, it's harder for them to think really beyond just the everyday survival. Now, I do want to show you some other things as to what else was looked at. So I'm not unpacking all of these specifically, but remember, these are high correlations. So again, Dr. Bailey can explain what all of these mean. I didn't go into depth in this presentation. But again, all the correlations are quite high, and where again, as happiness increases, legalism decreases. So again, the bottom right-hand corner, Switzerland, Austria, Finland. Then on the upper left-hand corner, Tanzania, Rwanda, Zimbabwe. Human Development Index, individualism. So this was not as obvious, but still very high, 0.72. Disease prevalence, so you see as disease goes up, legalism goes up, because again, basic needs aren't being met, right? Civil liberty, and then religiosity. So being just percentage of those who are less religious in those cultures. So, and I think there's one more. Yeah. And gender parity, that really wasn't a whole lot there, but again, as I said in my line of work, point 2 is I still talk about them. All right, thank you very much for your time, and then we'll be able to answer questions later. Again, that's when, I don't know, Dr. McBride, do you want to add anything now in these last few minutes?
I think that was good. I mean, it's really important to remember that we may not be able to understand some of the theological complexities of our message without some basic needs being met. And this really was Jesus' message, and this was the message of the early Christian church. Stark argues that the Christian church thrived because it met these basic needs, and then people understood what it was to be a Christian except Christ. So, and this is what Dr. Bailey just talked about in his presentation. Engagement in the community makes a difference. We got to address human needs before we can expect them to understand our theology. The simple theology of righteousness in Christ is best understood if basic needs are met.
Right, thank you.
Our third presentation in the triumvirate of the Global Health Survey presentations is again by Karl Bailey, A Garland and a Chain, the persistent influence of family religious environment on adult SDA church members raised in the church. And this is Karl, Miralisa, also known as Smiley, I remember, Tan, Lena Baltazar, and Duane McBride.
Okay, so this is the talk where I admit, as a cognitive psychologist, that sociologists have something to bring to the table. That's how this is going to go.
Amen.
So actually, I'm very fortunate to work. I'm very fortunate to work in a school of social and behavioral sciences. Sometimes psychologists end up siloed off in our psychology departments, where we treat problems as individual problems when they're actually systemic problems. So what we're going to see here is a teeny tiny effect. And then I'll say, but you just heard what Alina and Duane said, and so we know why this effect is teeny tiny. So I've spoiled the whole talk for you. Now you can take a 10-minute nap and just come back for the end. All right, so just to remind you that this is work funded by Archive Statistics and Research and the Andrews University Research and Creative Scholarship Office. So once again, we're looking at Global Church Member Survey Wave 2. Same data set that we were talking about before. And what we're asking about this time is a question that involves whether or not it's possible for family environment to overcome that really strong effect of culture, right? So what Alina and Duane just showed you is that the cultural conditions, however we want to measure them, the cultural conditions shape the experience of church members in really profound ways. So the question is, well, maybe if we could get people to engage in family worship at a higher rate, maybe that could overcome the effects of culture. Is that possible? Right? The idea here would be that what happens in the home would become like a garland on your head or a chain around your neck, an inheritance you would take with you throughout your adult life from your parents. And of course, we do know that religiosity is passed on within a family environment, right? No family environment, religious transmission becomes much more difficult, right? Holding an evangelistic series gets you far fewer church members than simply raising children in the church, right? Raising children in the church has a really good yield compared to an evangelistic series. It's fantastic. So we know that religiosity in the main is passed on in a family environment. And we know that the more that parents are involved with their children, we get greater internalization. So this is some work that was done on the Andrews University Risk Behavior Survey. Duane and Alina constructed, or let's say revised, an instrument that looked at parental involvement and conflict with their children. This is retrospective self-reports from the children, and it turns out that it predicts all kinds of really good outcomes, better academic outcomes, It predicts better religious internalization, predicts some things about peer relationships later on, so some good things with that. So we know that kind of generally parental involvement, family environment passes on some things about religion. And if we ask, well, why might this be happening? One strong hypothesis comes from Barbara Fies's work that suggests that family rituals, hopefully ritual isn't a bad word for us today, family rituals might be an important mechanism. So what do we mean by family rituals? Well, there are two kinds of things that people do in their families often. Some of those things are routines. Routines are about getting stuff done, right? So your family folding of the laundry is probably not a ritual, but it does get the clothing folded, right? So we have lots of routines. We don't think about them while we're doing them. People can measure them. People can observe them. We do it over and over. And whether or not these things happen tells us about family organization. So organized families have higher well-being because things are getting done, and so we're not stressed. Great. Family rituals tell us who we are. Now, family worship might be one of these rituals. So it happens frequently, but it doesn't just happen to get something done. It happens in order to say, this is right, this is who we are, and it fosters a sense of belonging and identity. Some of those things that we want when we're forming a community so that we can do things, right? If we can have rituals in our church as well that do these kinds of things, right? So here, again, I don't want ritual to be a bad word. Ritual in this Barbara Fies context means things that tell us who we are and make us want to belong. Okay? That's what we mean by rituals. And what's important in this model is that that meaning is generational. It's passed on from generation to generation. And so that ritual persists over time, right? This is the way my parents did things. This is the way I do things. And I don't do it because I'm not thinking about it. I'm doing it because it tells me who I am. Right? So when my family gets together every evening to have family worship, we sing, we play our ukuleles and our guitars, and that's meaningful to us. We're not doing it just to get the guitar playing done because it needs to be checked off on the to-do list. We're doing it because that's who we are, right? We're a family of multi-instrumentalists, right? It's part of our identity. All right, so our question here is, do we find an immersion effect? If we take the family histories of people in the church member survey, some of whom grew up in the church, some of whom joined as children, some of whom joined as teenagers, do we find that the longer you've been raised in the church, the more rituals we see, and then the greater impact that has on your Adventist church member experience, right? That's our goal here. So in the Global Church Member Survey, there's an item that asks about your personal history with the Adventist Church. And we took 3 of those personal histories. I grew up in the church and joined as a teenager. I did not grow up in the church, but I joined as a teenager. I grew up in the church and I've been connected since birth. And my family and I joined when I was a child. So these 3 different kinds of experiences. And then we subsetted the data set. So we only looked at people who are 21 years of age and older. So these are only adults. We want to see if we have persistent effects. And we made sure that they were all second generation Adventists. So their parents were Adventists. Okay. So we're looking at people who, so we don't want people who joined as a teenager, but their parents didn't join as well, right? We wanted to make sure that everybody said, okay, I have been part of an Adventist family, whether that's a family that was Adventist before I was born, or whether that was a family where we all joined together, right? We want people who agree that they're part of an Adventist family. And then we looked at a number of different scales. So these are scales, question time you could ask me about how we made sure that they were functioning as scales. These are all scales that we've checked with exploratory, confirmatory factor analysis. We've checked to make sure we've got single factor saturation. We've done many, many things with many, many numbers. So this is a measure of family religious environment. These are items that look at what it was like. So retrospective items, what was it like growing up? The only one we've left out is the item that said Adventist education was an important factor in my family. So I'm an Adventist teacher. I believe in Adventist education, but Adventist education is so different in different parts of the world. And because of that variance in access and what Adventist education looks like, in some parts of the world, Adventist education is about the in-group, is about Adventists teaching Adventists, and in other parts of the world, Adventist education is missional. It's about Adventists teaching non-Adventists. And so we just left that item out here, and we only looked at the other 7 items, which look at closeness, involvement in the community, so prosocial things, ability to communicate, Bible reading, praying, morning and evening worship, and then seeing your parents involved with the church, at least in terms of attendance. And so the first question we might ask is, are there differences in the family religious environment by family history? Now, if you look back here, you can see, whoops, if you look back here and you press the right button, you can see that we've got differences. Now, they are small differences, but because we have such large samples, we're very confident about where the center of that distribution is. And so we have rather large effect sizes, right? We have effect sizes of 0.8. That's a large effect size. When we compare people who were born in the church versus people whose families joined, and when we compare people who joined as children and joined as teens, right? In both cases, the longer your family has been in the church, the more your family did those things. So we've got, for the immersion effect, we've got the first piece we need, which is that the longer your family has been in the church, the more you have been in a family that has developed religious routines and religious rituals within the family. Fantastic. And, like, it's a big difference, right? So then the question is, can those big differences in family religious environment translate to adult religious experiences? And if you were excited about big effect sizes, and you were excited about my network, and you were excited about correlations of 0.8, it's time for you to be sad. Because everything I'm going to show you from here are teeny tiny effects. So here's how it goes. If we look at core Adventist beliefs, some of these are distinctive. So Sabbath keeping, Ellen White is a prophet. Distinctive Adventist beliefs, but core to what it means to be Adventist. Christ's coming is near, right? That's the Adventist part of Seventh-day Adventist. Some of them are shared with our brothers and sisters in Christ. So our beliefs, we believe that beliefs come from Scripture, right? That's something shared among Christians. We believe in a personal God who seeks relationships. That's shared among Christians. So we have some things that are unique, some things that are shared, but these are core. Again, they form a lovely single-dimensional scale. And if we look at family religious, personal family religious practices as adults, so not retrospective, this is what I'm doing now, right? So our core personal devotional practices, reading the Bible, personal devotions, Sabbath school lesson, reading the writings of Ellen White, and then morning or evening worship with members of my family, along with personal prayer, reading writings by other Adventist authors beyond Ellen White, and then spending time thinking about Jesus' life, which we're counseled to do by Ellen White, in fact, as well as the Bible. If those, again, make a nice scale. If we look at those two things, belief, behavior, we find very small effects. In fact, the word that you're supposed to use for that is negligible or trivial. So these are small effects. Now, we're very confident that those effects are there. So it turns out that we have enough data that when we do some Bayesian modeling, we say, well, let's start with our assumptions and see whether or not we have evidence to move those assumptions. I am very confident that there are teeny tiny effects. Okay. So I know the effects are teeny tiny, and I'm very, very confident that they are there. They're just very small. In some cases, incredibly small. Look at that 0.001. But I'm really confident about that 0.001. Okay, so what that tells us is that the big effects we see in how long you've been in the church or what happens in the home are not translating to big effects in adult religious belief or adult religious private behavior. Okay, but maybe something else, right? Spiritual growth. So here are 4 spiritual growth items. I've grown spiritually. This is last 12 months. I've changed my priorities. I more often have a sense of gratitude. I think more about spiritual questions. All good things we want people to do. Opposite of that would be spiritual struggle. I think I'm lost. My faith has been shaken. I've lost some meaning. What happens? Very little. So again, these are in the negligible or trivial range. We would need to get to about 0.2, and unfortunately, because I'm so confident, my confidence intervals don't even bump into 0.2, right? They're real narrow. So what that tells us is that we've got higher levels of spiritual struggle in people who join later, and right, that's even driven if we compare teenagers and people as children, but these effects are still quite small, right? They're larger than effects for behavior and belief, particularly for struggle, when we compare people who joined as, particularly for struggle for both people who joined as children versus people who joined as teenagers, or people born in the church versus people who joined, but they're still quite small. And so again, big effects in religious environment in the home, much smaller effects for adults later on. If we look at prosocial behavior, which I've labeled as commitment to others here, same scale I used earlier, and we look at legalism, we can ask, are we seeing effects here as well? And again, these are just like the others, quite small. So again, in the direction we would expect, but really attenuated. Why might that be happening? Well, sometimes when we see attenuation like this, it's because there's other things going on. And so one thing we can do is ask whether we see changes in the relationship between two variables. So what we're doing here now is we're asking whether the people who were in, right, so we saw differences earlier in the religious environments that people had, but not everybody who was born in the church was in a family that had a lot of strong religious rituals. Not everybody who joined the church had a family that didn't develop very many, right? So there are differences within each of those groups. And so what we can ask is, are those differences within groups correlated with the outcomes later on? And the answer is they are, and they are in ways that you would expect, right? So if I just walk you through what we're looking at here, that circle is representing the largest possible correlation, the correlation of 1.0, which we'll never find. And the color that you see is telling you about the direction. So blues are positive, reds are negative. If you are colorblind, I put the numbers underneath so you can see and figure out which direction we're going in. And then the size, the magnitude is shown by how much of that pie is colored in. So what this is saying is that if we look just within, top row here, just within people in the Adventist church since birth, we get a correlation of 0.19. And Alina said that 0.2s make us happy in the social sciences for individuals. She's right. So I'm pretty happy with that, right? So we're accounting now, this means we're accounting for 4% of the variance in core beliefs. But right, it's the accumulation of many small effects that shifts a person's life. So core beliefs, the correlation between how strong the religious environment was when you were a child and your core beliefs now is positive. Good, right? That means that better religious environment, stronger religious environment, more commitment to the core beliefs. It's exactly what we want to see. Same thing with religious practices. Here the correlation is 0.27. That's nice. Spiritual growth, 0.13. That's smaller. Spiritual struggle, that's negative. That's good. Commitment to others, positive. And then legalism, there's basically no effect, right? So whether or not you're legalistic doesn't have to do with the strength of the religious environment. And again, that's something we want to see, right? It would not be good if religious rituals were driving everyone towards a reliance on their own behavior rather than Christ's covering blood. So then the question is, what happens when we look at people who join the church later in their childhood? And here you see that the correlations are attenuated, the positive correlations are attenuated, and in fact the negative correlation we see for spiritual struggle flips, right? So core beliefs, weaker, religious practice, weaker, spiritual growth, not much change, so I didn't outline it. Commitment to others also didn't change very much, but legalism is higher, right? That's the one that works against the pattern. So now legalism is higher, and spiritual struggle flips. So that meant that more religious environment led to more spiritual struggle. So this possibly explains why we see such small effects when we just look at individual look at differences between those groups, right, with what an individual variable, is that there seems to be an interaction here with how how strong the religious environment was as a child, and then what happens later, right? So that might be part of what is weakening those effects. If we compare now the people who joined as children and the people who joined as teenagers, you can see that we get that effect here for those two groups as well. So people who joined as children actually in many ways look a lot like the people in the church since birth, but people who joined as teenagers, you see smaller effects, except for that one larger effect on legalism there. All right, where's my button? Okay, so here's what we know. We've got this small but continuing influence of family religious environment, and here, right, this is the part where I admit, probably what's happening is that huge hammer of culture is intervening in between family religious environment and when we're measuring people as adults, right? Because we truncated it at 21, but we have some 60-year-olds in here. They have 40 years of experience as adults in that culture, right? And so we have this small but continuing influence, and it's really being attenuated. And that, again, that's probably a cultural effect. That would be my guess. So that doesn't mean we should abandon teaching families how to build strong religious rituals. In fact, it tells us that this is one of the many tools we need to have in our Adventist nurturing and discipling tool belt. So if you wanted me to say this is the one thing that we can do, I don't have that, but I do have one small tool, and with many small tools, you can build some magnificent machines. All right, thank you.
All right, that was a lot to digest, and it's time for a Q&A, which we have about 15 minutes. Rob, let's get you as the first questioner.
I promised Karl an interesting question, but it's a very mundane question at the end. We heard that your data's by division, but the networks that you were showing were by countries. So can you identify individual countries?
So the answer is no and yes. So what we have in the data set are unions. So we can identify unions. And once you identify unions, what you can do is you can take countries that have multiple unions and you can stick all those unions together. And then we have some unions that cross international borders. So what we did for that was to create, so if you look carefully at the dots in the second presentation, you'll see that some of them have geographical names. So Franco-Belgium isn't actually a country, right? So what we did is we took the international data from those data sets and we population weighted it using a 2017 or a 2018, using a 2018 weight with population, and then the nearest data set that we could get to the 2017-2018 thing. So we constructed what we'll call country or union geographical units, and that's actually what we ran in those correlations. But I think what you see when those unions cross international boundaries is that they're relatively similar culturally, which is why they're crossing the boundary. So yeah, that's how we did it.
Isn't that amazing, the work that they did? I just love
It's
it.
such a sociologist thing to do, right?
So I'm going to throw a question out to everyone across all of your studies, and you can answer this however you would like. This is a lot of navel gazing, right? I mean, this is Adventist looking at ourselves and going really deep at religious practices and all of these perspectives. Can you widen the lens if you were talking to someone outside of our church, but who was in a Christian environment, and then widen the lens yet more and talk about what things you've learned and why they're important to a more societal sort of group? What would you say to them, and how would you think about what these findings mean in a larger context?
Duane, you want to go first? You want me to do it?
I can start. Look, I mean, the data that we've all talked about really suggests, in preaching to the larger Christian world, that if you get your congregation involved in the community, it actually strengthens their commitment and involvement in your church. And that if you get folks involved in the community and make the community a better place, then the community may be more ready to understand the core Protestant belief of righteousness by faith. So I think to the wider Christian community, our data is quite applicable. Get your members involved in the community. They'll be more involved and loyal to your church. They'll be more pro-social in a very general sense. And they'll be more willing to understand the core Protestant doctrine that righteousness by faith. To the broader society, look, I've been in the public health field a long time. And in public health, we always look for partners. Who can we partner with to improve the health of the community? Faith communities are great partners because their members are more willing to be involved in the community and not charge anything. So they believe they can change the world with Matthew 25. Every year in our health department here in Berrien County, we gave a Friend of Public Health Award. I wanted to give enemy, but they wouldn't let me. But anyway, Friend of Public Health, we've often given it to churches because of what they've done in the community. They've helped with vaccinations. They've helped distribute food. They've helped distribute in emergencies. So I think there's a natural alliance between development, public health, and the faith community that we can use these data to advocate to the broader Christian community, broader faith community, and the broader society.
Yes, I think there are two principles, and I think they're interrelated. So the first has to do with what David Williams told us this morning and what you saw in the second talk, and that is that we grossly underestimate how much people's everyday circumstances play a role in all of their experiences, including their religious experiences, and those differences are structural. So there are some big impacts that we need to make on the world that have nothing to do with getting people to get their theology right. So, right, people need to eat and have clean water and a place to live and not be worried about whether they're going to be murdered or not. And that's, I mean, you saw the correlations with legalism, right? So those concerns, if we attack those concerns first, we can do a lot to deal with theology problems that don't involve us having a Bible study. The second thing is that if you look at the network analysis that I reported in the first talk, I think one of the desires that people have, in fact, one of the things that most animates my children when because right, they have two parents who are teachers, so they have to help out with lots of things. And it turns out they like helping out more in the community than they like helping at home. And that's because knowing that you're making a difference in somebody's life is really animating, and we're not tapping that enough. So, right, at the cultural, at the sociological level, we know that there are immense problems that are having a substantial influence on the church. And at the psychological level, we know that people want nothing more than to be helpful to another human. And if we can tap that power to make a difference in people's real lives, I think that's a take-home that applies to anybody on the planet. We have this untapped power among human communities, right, including church communities, right, that can make a big difference on the planet.
And churches may be one of the best places because they think they should make a difference. So that's why I would argue to general society, partner with your churches. Hey, Alina, what's a social work perspective on these data?
So social workers are actually a combination of psychologists and sociologists, except what I like to tell my dad, the sociologists, we actually help people. They just study them. So we actually try to combine those two. We look at the person, the individual person, and the environment. So we have to do both. Like you said, yeah, there isn't a whole lot on the parenting aspect, but there's still something, right? And I, as a certified family life educator, feel like in supporting and educating parents, we're still making a difference in children's lives, which ultimately then impacts the community, which ultimately can impact the culture. But we need to realize how big the cultural influence really is, like Dr. Williams talked about, how it impacts the individual. So it's that bi-directionality, right? The individual impacts the environment impacts the individual, and we need to really work on both levels. Any other questions?
So from a parenting perspective, one of our takeaways is that we do better raising our children to help clean other people's houses than to clean our own houses. So we should do co-op kinds of things where we take our kids over to other people's houses.
I think
and other people's kids come to your house.
Right.
Exactly. Well, of course, that's part of the co-op. We need other questions besides those that have been. Yes, Kennedy.
Thank you. My question is to Karl. in the first presentation, you demonstrated that in order to get people to demonstrate pro-social behavior, you need to teach them practical things that teach them how to do good, and you had a list of things rather than trying to get them into the church pews. And I thought that tends to draw a clear dichotomy between faith and deeds, which is, I think, is contrary to what the position that the Bible takes, specifically in James chapter 2, verse 18. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds, which clearly shows that faith is the fundamental that leads to pro-social behavior. Please advise.
So James also says that we're not to say to people, go in peace, be warm and fed. So what I'm saying with the network model is that at the core, we need to involve church members in action. So if all the church members are doing is coming to church and then going home, and we never extend the invitation and make it easy, right? So extend an invitation and make it easy for people to have an active part in their congregation. Right, so if I think about my church when I was growing up, my church invested heavily in making sure that the youth were invested in their church, right? So I was Sabbath school and superintendent sometimes. They let me preach sermons. We did special music all the time. But that's because the church members put a lot of effort into making it really easy for the youth in the church. So there wasn't a lot of barrier, and they would go out of their way to provide you with everything you needed in order to do things, right? So I think, right, so James certainly does say, right, I'll show you my faith by my deeds. But James is saying, I think, as a whole, that we can't have a church that involves the passive reception of information, right? And that's what we mean when we say to people, go in peace, be warm and fed, right? You've heard the message, so that should be sufficient for you. But rather, it needs to be a church where anybody who comes in is given a place not just to learn, not just to understand, but a place to serve in a meaningful way as part of a meaningful community. That's what the network is saying. So things on the periphery doesn't mean they don't matter, right? They're part of the network. They're not off, separated from the network, but they are not the core to the network. The core to the network is, as you said, exactly that, right? It's just not words, but it's deeds. It's meaningful action. And like this is what the church is pushing us towards with total member involvement, right? It's not involvement in hearing, but involvement in doing. If every person in the pews has a place in the church during the week or on Sabbath where they're making a difference in somebody else's life, I think that's how you drive a vibrant congregation. So thanks for the opportunity to clarify.
But if I was looking at your network analysis correctly, and I may have gotten confused, personal religiosity is not connected to pro-social behaviors.
It's not directly connected.
Not directly connected. It's connected through a channel.
It's right. It's connected through the doing of things for and with other people.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Which is the core of what then does that mean in terms of interventions? You're saying the total church. What was the term again? I know the term. The total church.
Total member. It's TMI.
Total member involvement.
Total member involvement. Yeah, so you can use the acronym TMI, just you have to make sure that you're in the right context.
Right.
So, right, so so the kinds of interventions I would think about would be things like doing an analysis of how people get opportunities to serve in the church. What are the barriers to entry into a ministry in the church? And then there would be questions. So at my home church at PMC, One of the things that we have all of our small group ministry groups do is be involved in a service project and be involved in a social activity together. So we form small groups that just exist for a couple months, but they're required to engage with each other socially and engage in service as part of that small group experience, right? And I think that's the kind of intervention that might be helpful, because it's building a community within a community, right? So that's going to feed your need to have relationships and make a meaningful difference. But it's also lowering barriers to entry, right? It's really easy to sign up for one of those groups. So I think that's the kind of intervention would be to look at to choose a church and do the intervention in a church where you say, what can we do to lower barriers to entry into a meaningful ministry? And then what can we do to build that ministry team into a strong, tightly knit social community.
And we need to pay particular attention to those marginalized members who are perhaps older or who perhaps have disabilities. This ties into your work, Shannon. The folks that are maybe the least likely to be able to participate meaningfully, and that includes children too, right? Because they're the ones that are most likely to be, pushed aside or to not be involved in things that are actually meaningful.
Right.
So the ways in which you do this really have to do with intentionally trying to include people that may not normally be included.
This is exactly what I mean by barriers, right? So you would want to analyze who's serving in our church. So you have lots of barriers. Some barriers are too much serving, which leads to burnout, but other barriers are, well, nobody's asked me or nobody knows me, or right, I don't know if I can physically get to that location in the church to do that, right? So yeah, I think an analysis of barriers would be the first intervention I would think about. Yeah.
Oh, so much. I would love to even get into a discussion about the role that authoritarianism in societies plays in the drive towards security and the drive then towards, associating that with legalism. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting questions and all kinds of interesting implications that are sociological as well as psychological, as well as social work intervention related.